Now, I'm excited because we're actually at the point in our study of the Bible where we're about ready to open up the Gospels and look at Jesus. And I love to look at Jesus. But before we do that, I thought we could just take some time and I could try to give you some motivation for thinking about Jesus. And I know if you've made it this far in these videos, you probably already are a Christian, and so you don't really need motivation to think about Jesus, because we as Christians, we love to think about Jesus. But the fact is, even if I were standing before a group of unbelievers, they would probably not be motivated to think about Jesus, but they should be motivated to think about Jesus, because everybody has to do something with Jesus. You absolutely have to do something with Jesus for a lot of reasons, but let me give you two. The first is the influence of Jesus. There is no one who has influenced our world the way Jesus has. There's no one who's had an impact on history like him. In fact, somebody has said if you were to write the history of the last 2,000 years down in a book, it would obviously be a pretty long book. But if you took out the impact of Jesus, if you said, I'm going to cut out every page that has the impact or influence of Jesus somewhere on it, you would not have a very big book left, because Jesus' impact is just absolutely everywhere. And perhaps what is most interesting about the impact and influence of Jesus is the fact that, honestly, if you look at his life and his death by itself, you would never have expected it. This is not someone that you would have expected to influence the world, especially if you look at the way he died. As John Ortberg has written, on the day after Jesus' death, it looked as if whatever small mark he left on the world would rapidly disappear. Instead, his impact on human history has been unparalleled. After his disappearance from the earth, the days of his unusual influence began. And this is strange, because normally when someone dies, their impact on the world begins to get smaller and smaller. I mean, imagine Napoleon during his lifetime, but Napoleon now, you know? But Jesus' impact was greater 100 years after his death than during his life. It was greater still 500 years after his death. After 1,000 years, his legacy laid the foundation for much of Europe. After 2,000 years, he has more followers in more places than ever. And that really makes you think. Everybody has to consider Jesus. Everybody has to do something with Jesus, because Jesus is everywhere. Jesus has had this tremendous impact on world history, on this world as we know it, and yet not at all the way people normally make an impact. In fact, as one author explains, if you were to look at important people throughout history and make a list of everyone you would expect to have the most influence on the course of events, Jesus would probably come in last. There's where he was born, for one thing. He was born in an insignificant place and raised by insignificant people, born into a family of carpenters. As someone has put it, he was a small town Jew in a time when it wasn't all that good to be a Jew. And yet today, in what some people consider the most powerful nation on earth, presidents are often questioned and evaluated on the basis of their opinion of him. There's the fact that he's just from this out-of-the-way place, a small nation controlled by others. As far as we know, he never traveled out of the Middle East. And yet today, there is no continent on earth where people actually live where you won't find his followers. I mean, this is amazing. Here you have Jesus, who for most of his life, no one knew. When suddenly he comes into public attention in the late 20s of the first century, when he was around 30 years old, and virtually everything we know about him is crammed into this short space of time, just 3 years or so, after which he chooses during which he chooses a group of insignificant followers. He does some miracles, and then he's picked up by the authorities in Jerusalem, and there's some trials or sort of trials, and he's executed on the charge of being a rebel leader, King of the Jews. And then, as someone has explained, like many thousands of Jews in that period, he dies by crucifixion, a horrible method of killing, really torture, a way of Rome saying you're nothing. And yet today, this man who was crucified like a nobody, like a criminal, he's unavoidable. This unlikely character is the central figure of Western civilization. Jesus, as someone else has said, is history's most familiar figure. You can't get around Jesus. His influence is everywhere. There's a book on the influence of Jesus, and he just walks through some of the places, some of the surprising places you find the influence of Jesus. Like he says, take a map. Throughout history, powerful men have sometimes tried to force people to remember them by having towns and cities named after them. If you could have a city named after you, that would be a pretty big thing. When Jesus was alive, he didn't even have a home, and yet today you can't really look at a map without being reminded of his name. This is true where I'm from. When we moved to South Africa, we moved from a place in America called Quakertown, which is named after the followers of Jesus. The next biggest city near us was Bethlehem, which of course was named after the birthplace of Jesus. I went to school on the other side of the country in the city of Los Angeles, which is the city of angels, and my wife's parents live in Santa Maria, named of course after Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's not just maps that remind you of Jesus, though. It's also calendars. Powerful nations have sometimes tried to establish their importance by dating the calendar around their existence. For example, Roman emperors would date events according to their reign. During the days of the French Revolution, the government tried to begin a new calendar to try to minimize the influence of the church. It lasted about 12 years. The Soviets tried to establish a new calendar as well. The idea of a Jewish rabbi named Jesus trying to impose a calendar on anyone, though, would have been laughable. From seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus comes to the public attention of a small nation named Israel for hardly any period of time, and then he's gone. And yet today, every time we look at a calendar, BC, AD, we're reminded that this incredibly brief life has somehow become the dividing line of history. We can continue from maps and calendars to museums. We don't really know what Jesus looked like. We don't really know what his first followers looked like either. Yet you walk through any significant art museum and you'll find artists attempting their best to give us pictures of Jesus and those who followed after him. There's architecture as well. It's ironic that Jesus was born in the days of Herod because Herod was known as a great builder, that he was really the greatest builder of his time. And Jesus, he didn't build any buildings that we know of, though he was a carpenter, so maybe he built something for Herod. But he had no great building programs, and yet today there are buildings all over the world that have been designed for the glory, not of Herod, but of Jesus. People are still building buildings for Jesus. We might go further. It's not just maps, calendars, art, architecture that you see Jesus' influence. You might go to a library. There's only one time in the Gospels where you find Jesus writing anything, and that's in the dirt. And yet there are more books written about Jesus than anyone else. He is without a doubt, I'm quoting here, he is without a doubt the most written about and discussed person in the history of the world. And that's true, isn't it? People get their, how many PhDs have been written around something that Jesus had to say? It starts shortly after he died. Paul Johnson writes, the earliest surviving document dealing with him was circulated in the 50s of the first century, about 20 years after his death. Well, at least that's what Paul Johnson thinks. Around that time. Could have been a little earlier. By then, though, biographies of him written in the Aramaic tongue he normally spoke were circulating. Within a half century of his death, 4 biographies written in Greek had been published, and all have come down to us. By the end of the century, 45 authentic documents about him had appeared, and these also have survived. Since then, first documents, then entire books have been written about him in pretty much every published language. Today, there are over 100,000 printed biographies of Jesus in English alone, and many more monographs. More than 100 were issued in the first decade of the 21st century. Wow. It's pretty remarkable to think of all these scholars with all these degrees spending all this energy writing about someone who probably spent most of his working career as a carpenter. Jesus spent most of his adult life working with his hands. Then one day, at God's direction, he changed jobs. He became a teacher, and his 3-year teaching and preaching ministry was so significant that many of the world's greatest minds are humbled by his wisdom. This is awesome. Take the man we call the Apostle Paul. If you read the letters Paul wrote in the New Testament, it's obvious he was a highly intelligent individual. He studied under a man named Gamaliel, who some think was one of the most famous teachers of his day. The Apostle Peter admitted that some of Paul's writings were even difficult for him to fully understand, and yet Paul recognized that Jesus was above him in every way. Brilliant minds don't usually deliberately choose to spend their lives studying under someone who wasn't as intelligent as they are. Paul gladly gave up everything for the surpassing value of knowing Christ, because Paul believed that in Christ were hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. One author remarks, the historical impact of Jesus' thinking is so pervasive that it's often taken for granted. The record of his life and teaching, the Gospels, have impacted the world so much that they've been translated into over 2,500 languages. In contrast, the second most translated book has been translated into about 60 languages. In the academic world, scholars keep score by how often an article they write is cited by other scholars. By this sheer worldly score, Jesus' intellectual impact is unprecedented. The words of Jesus' message are the most quoted, most analyzed, most contested, most influential moral and religious discourse in all of human history. And so, if it's not becoming clear, the impact of Jesus' short life here on earth has been profound, and not just on things like maps, calendars, dates, but also in the way people think and act. For example, he's changed the way the world thinks about greatness, the treatment of children, education, compassion, concern for the outsider, and really we could go on and on. If you're interested in that, you could read a book named Dominion by Tom Holland, who describes the impact of Jesus' life on the way people think. One man's written, those who love Jesus and those who don't agree on this one fact, that in all of human history, no one has made the difference that Jesus has. I like how an unbeliever named H.G. Wells once put it, and he definitely was an unbeliever. I am a historian, I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most influential figure in all of history. And yet, ultimately, really, it's not just Jesus' influence that makes it so important for us to consider what the Gospels have to say about him, because obviously there were other influential people, and you don't really need to think much about many of them. What makes it important for us to think about Jesus is what happens when you combine the influence of Jesus with the claims of Jesus. I think it's Tim Keller, actually, who points this out. Jesus made astounding claims about himself. And when you combine those claims with his influence, you absolutely have to do something with him. In fact, there's a book on the history of religion written by someone named Huston Smith, or Houston Smith. Not sure how to pronounce that first name. And he says, there have only been in the history of the world, two prominent and influential figures whose lives were so incredible and so tremendous that the people around them did not just ask who you are, but they asked what you are. Those two people were Buddha and Jesus. As Smith points out, the responses of those two people were completely opposed. In both cases, people wanted to worship them. And Smith says, Buddha said, absolutely don't worship me. I'm not a god. Buddha always said, don't look at me, look at my doctrine. Jesus absolutely accepted worship. Jesus did not say, I am not God. He did not even say, I am a God. He said, I am God. Whenever people worshiped Jesus, he stood there calmly and took it. It's really striking, actually, at the end of Luke. How does Luke end? It ends with the apostles worshiping Jesus. And one reason that's striking is because when Jesus talks to Satan in the beginning of the gospel, he says you can only worship God. And in the book of Acts, same word being used. When Cornelius falls down before Peter, Peter says, don't worship me. I'm only a man. And yet at the end of the gospel of Luke, Jesus is worshiped by the apostles. They know who he is. He knows who he is. He said things like, whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And Jesus said things like that because he viewed himself as someone more important than just another ordinary man. He viewed himself as the very Son of God. And this is part of what makes his influence so surprising from an unbeliever standpoint, at least. Because if you were to make a list of people whose lives have had the longest enduring impact on history, you can put Jesus right up there at the top of the list. And if you were to make a second list of people who have claimed to be God, there would be all kinds of people you could put on that list as well. But here's the thing, and this is, again, Tim Keller, but it's so good. When you look at both lists, there is no one whose names are on both lists. Most influential, claim to be God, or I should say it like this. There's no one whose names are on both lists. The list most influential and the list claim to be God. There's no one whose name is on both those lists except for one person. That person is Jesus. Most people who are on the list claim to be God. They had no impact at all. Jesus is on both lists. You can't, which means you can't just ignore him. You have to come to some kind of conclusion about him. You have to go back to the records and ask, is he who he said he was or not? The claims are just too big. The influence is just too profound. Here's someone who changed the entire world, who claimed to be God, and who says your entire eternal future hangs completely on your attitude toward him. You have to do something with that. You absolutely have to do something with that. Now, fortunately, if we are going to get to know Jesus and evaluate his claims and come to a conclusion about him, we have lots of data and information to use. And our primary sources are going to be the Gospels in terms of his life here on earth. We have 4 witnesses to the impact of Jesus and to the person of Jesus in the Gospels. But I thought before we look at the Gospels, we could just take a quick moment and consider some of the earliest references we have to Jesus outside the Gospels. And these aren't the most important references to Jesus. We find those in the Gospels, but sometimes non-Christians will say things like, why should I consider Jesus when everything we know about him is in the 4 Gospels? That's so biased, which is actually really silly when they say things like that, because even if all we did have was the Gospels, we're talking 4 different accounts, not just one single source. And more than that, really, we have about 27 books by 8 different authors all about Jesus. And so there are lots of different attestations to Jesus. Plus, we have other Christian writings in the hundreds. And yet, it's not just silly, it's also not true to say that, because there are non-Christian non-Christian texts that mention Jesus and offer descriptions of him. And they fall into 2 categories. There's Jewish texts and Roman texts. And in the first century, there were 3 main big Jewish books that we have still. And one would be the writings of Josephus, another would be the writings of Philo, and another would be what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls and the writings of Philo don't mention Jesus. And Philo is not very surprising because he's from Alexandria and he doesn't talk about Palestine hardly ever. The Dead Sea Scrolls are what we would call pre-Christian documents. They date before Jesus. But Josephus is different. There are at least 2 references to Jesus in Josephus. The first talks about Jesus' half-brother James. He writes, he, the high priest, seated the judges of the Sanhedrin council, and after he led them to the brother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah, the man whose name was James, and certain others, and accused them of having transgressed the law, he handed them over to be stoned. And then there's a second reference, and there are 2 versions of this reference. First, there's a Greek version, which says, about this time Jesus came. He was a wise man, if it's really proper to call him a man, because he was a person who did incredible works, a teacher of those who gladly welcomed the truth. He won over many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate condemned him to the cross based on evidence from the men of high standing from among us, the ones who loved him at the beginning did not abandon their love for him, because on the 3rd day he appeared to them alive. And these and 1,000 other wonderful things have been told him about the divine prophets. And the tribe which is called the Christians has not died out even to this day. And people doubt this version, obviously. They think some Christian scribe got hold of that and changed it. And you can see why they might think that. But there's also an Arabic version which says, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." And that's probably the authentic version. And it's important. Why? It's important because a Jew writing in the 90s AD tells us that during the rule of Pontius Pilate, between 26 and 36 AD, there appeared on the religious scene of Palestine a man named Jesus, who had the reputation for wisdom, and was able to do miracles. And he won a large following, and the Jewish leaders accused him to Pilate, and Pilate had him crucified, but his followers refused to abandon their devotion to him despite his shameful death, and reported that he was risen from the dead. That's the most important Jewish reference. And sometimes you'll have people say Jesus didn't exist or silly things like that. But even most unbelieving scholars would acknowledge that's actually just kind of nonsense talk. Even Bart Ehrman, he says, "I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period." And Robert Van Voorst agrees. "Biblical scholars and classical historians now regard it, the theory that Jesus didn't exist, as effectively refuted." Now, of course, people, say the earth is flat too, so people deny everything. But if you look at the evidence, it's clear that Jesus definitely did exist. And the scholars have a whole lot of different reasons for saying that, like the fact that no opponent of Christianity in the early days of the church ever said that he didn't exist. And that would have been such an easy rejection of the claims of Christ, right? But it's also because of outside statements, like this in Josephus. There are other references to Jesus. For example, there's another set of writings called the Babylonian Talmud, and this Talmud was a collection of teachings that was finalized in the 6th century. The writings began before that, but they were put in their final form at that point. So most statements are a little later historically and seem to be reactions to what Christians were teaching. But listen to these quotes. "Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray." Rabbi Hizda said that Rabbi Jeremiah bar Abba said, "What is that which is written? No evil will befall you, nor shall any plague come near your house. No evil will befall you means that evil dreams and evil thoughts will not tempt you, nor shall any plague come near your house means that you will not have a son or a disciple who burns his food like Jesus of Nazareth." Our rabbis, another quote, "Our rabbis have taught that Jesus had 5 disciples, Mattai, Nakai, Nezer, Bunai, and Toda." And some people I think it's Nakai that they think is actually Nicodemus, a different form of Nicodemus's name. "They brought Mattai to trial. He said, 'Must Mattai be killed? For it's written, when Mattai shall come and appear before God.' Psalm 92:2. They said to him, 'Yes, Mattai must be killed, for it's written, when Mattai dies, his name will perish.' Psalm 41:5. They brought Nakai. He said to them, 'Must Nakai be killed? For it's written, the innocent Nakai and the righteous will not slay.' Exodus 23:7. They said to him, 'Yes, Nakai must be killed, for it's written, in secret places he slays the innocent,' which is Nakai. Psalm 10:8. Anyway, the passage continues, but it's talking about Jesus and certain disciples. Perhaps the most famous Talmudic passage about Jesus, though, is this. "It was taught on the day before Passover, they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days proclaiming, 'He will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him.' But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before the Passover." Also in the Talmud, we find statements that refer to Jesus' resurrection. "He then went and raised Jesus by incantation," is one quote. Another text, "Woe to him who makes himself alive by the name of God." Several other texts also refer to the disciples of Jesus miraculously healing others in Jesus' name. And this is important. Jews in the hundreds believed Jesus existed. They knew that he had done things that people said were supernatural feats. That's why they say it was magic. And we read early church fathers in the years 100 to 254, and that's exactly what they said the Jews were saying. Exactly that. One man writes, this strategy for dismissing the implications of Jesus' supernatural work suggests that both Christians and their Jewish opponents of the 2nd century recognized that no one could reasonably dispute that Jesus actually performed miracles. Now, that's Jewish writings. Let's look at references by Roman writers. This was a time of many religions, but we still can glean some data. First, there's a man named Thallus, who writes a history of the Mediterranean world around 52 AD. We don't have his original work, but we do have quotes of that work from around 230 AD. Apparently, he claimed that the darkness that accompanied Jesus' crucifixion was related to an eclipse of the sun. He writes, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. And you can find a lot of these quotes in a survey of the New Testament, partially at least, edited by a man named Andreas Kostenberger. Jesus lived, he was crucified. What does this tell us? Thallus thought Jesus lived, he was crucified, there was an earthquake and darkness at the point of his crucifixion. Then there's Tacitus, who describes the fire of Rome that Nero blamed, and says Nero blamed it on Christians to divert attention away from his own involvement in it. He writes, therefore, to squelch the rumor, Nero created scapegoats and subjected to the most refined tortures those whom the common people call Christians, a group hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ, who during the reign of Tiberius had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for the moment, the deadly superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the land which originated this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all sorts of horrendous and shameful practices of every part of the world converge and are frequently cultivated. So what does Tacitus tell us about Jesus? He lived in Judea. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He had followers who were persecuted for their faith in him. Suetonius, he writes, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, who instigated by Chrestus, never ceased to cause unrest. Acts 18:2 tells us about this. He seems to have confused Chrestus with Christus and assumed Jesus was alive during this time. But he tells us more about early Christians. He says, Nero inflicted punishment on the Christians, a sect given to a new and mischievous religious belief. So what do we learn from Suetonius? Well, he talks about Christians, and he describes them as being committed to their belief that Jesus was God, that they were persecuted, that they endured that persecution, that Jesus had this amazing impact on his followers to the point where they were willing to die for their beliefs. And then there are others. There's a man named Mara bar Serapion. He compares Socrates, Pythagoras, and Jesus. He writes, for what advantage did the Jews gain by the death of their wise king? He describes the execution of Jesus at the instigation of the Jews sometime not long before the fall of Jerusalem. Another man named Phlegon, who writes a chronicle of history around 140 AD. He describes the darkness surrounding the crucifixion, tries to explain it. A letter written to Emperor Trajan by Pliny the Younger, and he describes Christians as meeting on a certain fixed day, singing hymns to Christ, vowing not to do wicked deeds, and eating together, actually. And then there's another man named Lucian, another man named Celsus, who actually opposes Christians, who writes, Jesus had come from a village in Judea, was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. One scholar describes what we can draw from this. Celsus admits that Jesus was reportedly born of a virgin, but then argues this supernatural account could not be possible, and he offers the idea Jesus was the illegitimate son of a man named Panthara, an idea borrowed from the Jews who opposed Jesus at the time. But in writing this account, Celsus does confirm several important claims. Jesus had an earthly father who was a carpenter, possessed unusual magical powers, and claimed to be God. There are even more references, but what can we say from all these references? How might we summarize what we've learned from all these extra biblical sources? There was a person named Jesus who was born and who grew up in Palestine. He was born supposedly to a virgin. He had an earthly father who was a carpenter. He was a teacher. He was known as a wise man. He had some followers. He did miracles. He apparently predicted the future. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover under the direction of Pontius Pilate. He was buried. There were claims that he rose from the dead, after which a tremendous movement basically took over the world, where his followers claimed he was God and the fulfillment of Old Testament promises. This movement was started by disciples who said Jesus had risen and gone to heaven. They were serious about worshiping him. They were persecuted for their faith, and some were even martyred for their claims. And listen, you have to do something with that. That's the whole point. That's all coming from people who were basically hostile to Christianity. And we're saying, look, Jesus is the most influential person who ever lived, and he claimed to be God, and we know that much from people who were hostile to his cause. So what can we do? What do we need to do? We have to find out more about him. There's your motivation. You have to find out more about Jesus. And where can we go to get the best information about Jesus? Well, we have to go to the Gospels. And that's what we're going to do in the videos that follow.